Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am Sharice Moore, and I am excited to be sharing some information with you today on community asset mapping and how you can use it as a tool for planning for your program. And as we do that, we're going to go over these items that are listed here in the agenda. First, we're going to check in from last week and catch those folks up a bit who weren't with us last week. I'm assuming most of you were, but we're going to catch you up a bit on what happened with last week's webinar. Then we're going to talk a bit about community asset mapping and what the concept is and what it means, ways in which you can approach doing community asset mapping, and we're going to share some tools that you can use to help you facilitate that process. Then we're going to do some direct connections to community asset mapping and what it means for you in terms of your 3-year planning, and specifically speaking to the guidance that was shared as well as the template and how you can use community asset mapping to support your work. And then we'll provide you some resources and then give an overview of the last webinar in this 3-part webinar series, which will be next Tuesday. So if that sounds good, we'll go ahead and get started and move along with some of the things that happened last week. So quickly, those of you who were on the webinar last week, if you can just give me a quick thumbs up so that I'll know how much of the details I need to highlight and how much I can just quickly remind us. So if you can just quickly give me a thumbs up or a hand raise, sorry, for your participation last week. Great, great. I see some of you. I don't see many hands going up. I do see some. Hi, James. Okay, so I didn't see many hands going up, so I'm going to give you some quick refreshers and highlights on what happened last week and check in. This slide here highlights one of the big components of what was shared last week as we talked about AEP planning tools and the self-assessment. We focused on how you could access data tools last week. The webinar was recorded, so I would recommend that if you weren't in last week's webinar that you do go back to look at the slide that specifically spoke to data tools that are available as well as promising practices that can help support your work. And then this slide here introduced the strategic planning component, and what we learned from last week is that this visual shows how strategic planning happens from the outside in, with strategic planning really being your opportunity to assess where it is that you want to go and do some goal setting so that you can start to plan for what will happen as you get into the inner layers of the circle with the operational planning that really focuses on what it is that you're doing in your day-to-day work. And then we went deeper into some of the planning tools that are going to be necessary for you to complete your plan. One of the things that we're going to do today that we alluded to but didn't get into greatly last week was looking at a case study on what we're calling the Mawahil Adult Education Consortium. And today we're going to work some with that consortium so that you can really start to apply what we're working on with your pre-planning. Then we will show you how you use community asset mapping as a planning tool. One of the other pieces that was highlighted last week was the SWOT tool, and we learned from those who were in the webinar last week that SWOT, the Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats tool, was a new concept to many of you. And with community asset mapping, the O and the T components of SWOT are really what we look at when we're looking at doing an external assessment of the community by examining the opportunities that exist and the threats. And when you're doing an asset map, you're really looking at the opportunities. All right, so I see some typing happening. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything, but thank you for posting where that could be found, Veronica. I appreciate that. And we will move to one of the other pieces that wasn't necessarily highlighted last week, but really relates to what we are doing today. And we did highlight archived webinars in the webinar last week, and one that I want to bring to your attention is that about a year ago we did a webinar on community asset mapping as a tool really to strengthen your program, and today we're talking about it as a specific planning tool. And I just want to remind you to please be sure to continue to use the webinars as resources. They are recorded there for you, and if you missed the one from last year on asset mapping, it will really help provide a foundation for what we're talking about today. It highlighted 3 different organizations and how they use asset mapping to plan within their community. So it gave you real examples of asset mapping in the field and work. And we're going to revisit some of what was shared then, but we're also going to go deeper into the actual tools that you can use to do the work that was shared then. So now getting to where we are today with looking at our drill down on asset mapping and some strategies to help facilitate doing it, I want to ask you a poll as we get started, and this will be our first poll. And the thing I want you to respond to as you're looking at this is, when it comes to community asset mapping, I am or I have, and the options are I'm an expert mapper, I have some experience with asset mapping, or I'm brand new to asset mapping. Go ahead and take a moment and respond to that. I'm excited that we have about 50 people on the webinar with us today, and I'm going to broadcast these results as we get closer to hearing from a big portion of those participants. I'll give you about 30 seconds. If you haven't found the poll, it's on the bottom left of your screen, right above the resources, and you can check again that you're an expert asset mapper, some experience with it, or brand new to asset mapping. All right, I see a few more coming in, and you can see their results should be broadcasted for you. And right now it shows that most of you are brand new to asset mapping. 56% of you are brand new, so that's more than half of the group. And then the other 44% or so have some experience with it. And then there's none who would consider themselves an expert asset mapper. So I guess that's good, because if you were an expert at asset mapping, you'd be able to do this webinar and would need to be here. So for those who are on, this is the right place for you to be. Those with some experience, you will learn some tools, I hope, that will augment what you already know. And those who are brand new, I hope that you learn a lot through this webinar that will help you with planning and pre-planning for your 3-year asset or your 3-year planning. So I see some of you marked it also in the chat that you had some experience. So thank you for that, Annabelle and Laura. So this slide you're going to see a few times in this presentation, but basically it really provides the essence of what asset mapping is and community asset mapping. So it focuses on discover, asking, and connecting. And with discover, you are looking to learn something new about your community, about your consortia, about what's happening within the geographic boundaries for which you provide service. With asking, you're asking questions. You're asking questions that are related to the SWOT. And again, I know that that was a new concept to some of you, but again, thinking about the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats, that is the basis of where you start with strategic planning. And so here you're asking questions related to what opportunities exist, what assets exist within the community to help us meet our goals, create change, or do something new. And then finally, you are taking all of what you've discovered and the answers to the questions that you've asked, and you're making connections to how then can I leverage the assets that I've learned about, that I found out about, to help me meet my goals within my program, within my consortia, and where can I make those connections to continue to build my program and the work that we're doing in our consortia. So discover, ask, connect. We'll come back to that, but I want you to just think about that throughout as we are looking at everything that we do around asset mapping. So just quickly, some of the purposes for asset mapping I will list for you here, but it really helps you to think about the strengths and resources of the community. It helps you to put together what some call an asset directory, which is an amazing tool that gives you a go-to resource going forward because you've identified all of the assets that can help you do what you do better, and you provided who they are, where they are, and what they do in this asset directory. It can also help you find solutions to challenges that you might have because you have started to leverage the strengths of what's available within your service area, within your consortium area, within your community. And finally, it can help you determine what you can do with what you already are doing, with what you already have, to help you get what you need so that you can do more in that area. So these are the reasons that people do asset mapping, and the timing of which asset mapping is done is this next slide. And of course for you, you are doing it because you have a hard stop deadline June the 7th for when you have to submit your plan, and so you are given an opportunity that's on a timeline for doing asset mapping, and it is requiring that you incorporate that as a part of what your planning is as you're gathering resources about those other organizations that you can leverage. So again, it allows you to discover new partners, it allows you to start new programs, and really it helps you with making program decisions. If you are looking at, again, concerns that you may have or setting new directions for your consortia or broadening the scope of work that you're doing in your consortia, asset mapping can really help you make program decisions because you'll know what exists within your service area. So there are many ways in which you can do community asset mapping. For those of you who said you have some experience with it, some of these steps may seem familiar to you. Some of these steps may seem new to you. But this is the way in which I have done community asset mapping. It is a tool that I have used to really find out what's happening outside of my doors in my community so that I can better serve my students. It is a tool that I have used with other agencies to help them answer some questions about what it is their purpose is and how they want to do the mission of their work within their community. And it's a tool that I think really you can leverage in a lot of ways. And through the steps that are identified here, you'll see that It's not complicated. It doesn't have to be highly difficult to do community asset mapping in a way in which it's effective to help you plan and goal set. So the 6 steps that are here: defining your community, and for you this can be your consortia, member geographic boundaries, it can be your consortia as a whole, but you have to, as a group, determine what your boundaries will be and what your study area will be, because it is mapping, and that ultimately means that you are looking at geographic spaces and places. The second part is that you are thinking about what the critical questions are that you want to use your asset mapping to answer. So you want to ask yourself, how can this asset mapping fit into our 3-year plan? That's one of the critical questions, but there are others that relate to specific goals and goal setting that you want to do within your planning that you want to identify. And we'll talk more about the items, actually all of the bold items that you see, 2, 4, and 6. We're going to go into a bit more detail on those pieces. Then step 3 is determining how you want to leverage and use the stakeholders that you have. This is an important part of asset mapping because you can broaden the scope of who's involved in helping you plan through different roles that you can assign in asset mapping. And then step 4, selecting the types of assets that you want to identify. I've listed these here that are most common, but there are other types that you might want to look at. And then you will want to identify if you've done anything like this before so that you can leverage that work to not be starting with nothing in hand. And by that I know that in your previous planning efforts you were asked to do needs assessments. Asset mapping and needs assessments are kind of like yin and yang. They work together to form the whole. But with asset mapping, you're looking at what does exist that are the opportunities, the positive things within my community that I can build on and leverage to help us meet the goal. Whereas needs assessments, you're doing it from a deficit model of what's missing. What is it that we need to bring into the community? And again, they work together, and you can leverage what you've done with the needs assessment to strengthen the work with your asset mapping. And then finally, identifying and actually mapping the assets. So this is where you would list them, you'd list the groups, the individuals, the organizations, and you would organize it onto your geographic map. And then you would use that as a tool that you share with your stakeholders to make sure that everyone knows these are all the assets and how we plan to leverage them in our planning and implementation efforts. If you have any questions as I'm going through these opening slides, please feel free to type them into the chat, and there'll be other opportunities to ask questions as well. We're going to then move to our first chat, and that's going to be asking us to consider that step 2 that I shared that we would go into a little bit more of those bold ones, determining the critical questions that you want to ask as it relates to community asset mapping. So with this, I'm going to ask that you take a minute, you think about what is it that we are looking to determine through our asset mapping effort. What questions do we want to answer? I can give you some examples of what those might be, but think about them as they relate to your 3-year planning. What are potential new program areas to invest in? What assets can we look at to help us do what we want to do better? But others that you are thinking about, I'll give you a moment to think about what some of those critical questions are that you're trying to answer through asset mapping. Good. Thank you, Diana, for getting us started on the audience that we need to address and target for a service is great. Good, thanks, Dana. Retention, I see Alejandra typing that in the general chat. Good. Oh, good, Diane. Best Marshall, our internal, external resources to prepare our students. Wonderful. Good, CJ. Learning from and working with our partners for connected within the communities. Good. Good. Very good, Steve. And Annabelle, I see your type in the general chat too. Susie asked that we type the questions into the bigger chat pod on the left. But good, barriers and obstacles that our adults are meeting that are preventing them from participating in our programs. Good, good, Jody. That's a great question. One of the areas in which you learn from asset mapping is that when you have large geographic areas, how do you break those down? Because you do have different regions, even within a consortia, that look different and have different services. And some of the assets and partners that you will identify may or may not be able to provide services into all of the areas within your geographic region. And so how do you identify that and leverage that within your asset mapping? Great. Good, good. And you can keep typing because these are all questions that as you're starting to do your initial planning for asset mapping, you want to come to agreement on and be on one accord to consider what are the top questions that we really want to focus on, because you can do asset mapping in a broad way, but it's stronger if you're more targeted with what your focus is, with the questions that you're addressing. Good, good, good. All right. So thank you for that. And as I shared, I will keep that chat pod open for a minute just as you think about some of the other examples of critical questions that you can ask. This one comes directly from the guidance that's been provided to you for your 3-year planning. Who provides education and workforce services to adults in our region, and what are the types of services? And you'll see that's a critical question in page 5 of our guidance. Who can help us do what we want to do better? What are potential new program areas? How can the assets in the community become financial partners? That's an important one when we're trying to leverage financial resources. What opportunities exist to collaborate with these partners? I think someone else listed that in the critical questions that you were identifying below. And then one other person, I think it was Annabelle, that asked about retention, or maybe Alejandra. How can the assets help us increase student enrollment and remove those barriers? I think it was both Alejandra and Annabelle asked something similar to this in different ways. So it's important to have your top 2 to 3 questions that you want to use your asset mapping efforts for, so that you can target the work that you're doing, because as you're about to see, it takes resources to do asset mapping and to do it to the level at which we want to answer these questions thoroughly. All right, so thank you for that, and we'll move on to number 4 in the steps to asset mapping. As I shared earlier, it was those bold ones that we're going to be highlighting, and this is where you select the type of assets that you want to identify. And it relates really to step 2, which is determining the questions. Once you have the questions that you're looking to answer, you can decide how or what assets you're going to be looking at that you believe will help you with answering those target questions. And as you see here, this is an example of an asset map when you're looking at the types of assets. So it has, starting in the middle, the individual assets. So these are there assets of who is in our community, the demographic, the population, and it lists elderly and youth here in this example. But what about our social economic status as a community? Is that an asset that we can leverage? Other association types are on the outside. This gets to the bigger groups that we want to look at, which can include places like churches, your neighborhood associations, your nonprofits, your CBOs, other associations and larger groups within your region. And then what most of us are familiar with, because we tend to start from the outside before going narrow, and in reality we should start from the inside out with the individual to the association to institutions. The institutions are what most of us look at when we're doing asset mapping, and that's because these are most familiar to us, the things we can see the easiest, the businesses, the schools, the government agencies, hospitals, and such. But I'm going to ask that you think about this in terms of your questions that you're asking, what categories that you really want to engage in for identifying the asset types, and also using this as an opportunity to bring in the stakeholders. And I see Marianne asked the question as to what's the question behind this example. And I'm looking at it and I'm seeing artists and talent and cultural groups. So it must have been an asset map that related to doing some community cultural awareness building and arts and community related to that is what I'm reading into it from the types of assets that they identified. You also want to make sure that, again, your questions, which relates really to Marianne's question here, that the questions that you've identified tie directly to the type of assets that you've looked at. And your stakeholders can help you with that. They can help you to think about what and who all the types of assets can be based on what the critical question is that you're looking at answering. So as we look at tools to help us do this, I know this is small, but this is an asset inventory worksheet. It's one of the tools that you'll see below on the bottom left. This is a document that you'll be able to download and share with your stakeholders, and a good activity when you're bringing together those in your consortia who you want to help you do this planning and be inclusive in this work. It's a good way in which you can bring folks together to identify assets. So this tool is available for you. It lists the categories on the far left and then specific asset types within that. And it's marked Asset Inventory Document. Thank you, Sudie, for that. And then another tool that is shared here for you, because we want you to leave this webinar with actually tools that you can use, again, an opportunity to help you with doing some of the work that relates to engaging your stakeholders, which was step 3. One of the critical pieces is actually going into the community, going into your geographic region, and doing some community by community, member area by member area, street by street level detail to get to know what's really there. I know we may think that we understand what's happening in our communities from looking at some of the data tools and resources that we have from the webinar information that was presented last week. But thank you, James. But this will help you really get to thinking about beyond the data that we can pull off of the internet beyond the labor market data, what is really happening. And this is really a good tool to actually help you do that, because you go street by street and you collect information with your stakeholders, with your staff. It's a really great opportunity to do an asset inventory field trip. It's an asset-based approach to bringing in many eyes and many perspectives to observing what people see as assets. And this one, we have it as a fillable form for you so that you can use it to type in the name of the asset, where they're actually at, their actual physical location. And then you'll see we have ratings there. And I'm going to get into the ratings in a minute when I show you an actual example. But then the notes component help you recall specific things about that asset. And this fits into step 6, which is where you actually have identified the assets and started to map them. So here's an example, and again, that tool is number 2, the mapping tool, fillable, downloadable document. Thank you, Sudie, for typing that in. But here's an actual example of some work that happened in another organization where they wanted to identify their categories: churches, social services, economic development, and then others, what you see here. But they had several sheets of these inventory worksheets. They identified the name of the organization, where they actually were. All of these have the physical addresses because this is what's written, typed up after the debrief has happened. But actually during this asset mapping field trip, I'm going to call it, there are just notes and intersections because you're actually either physically driving throughout the community street by street and might not have access to the actual address, but you want to make sure that you can figure out how to come back to find out what the actual full information is for the resource. And then you'll see they rated them. And so what they did here is they rated the use of the asset, and it's an A, B, C, or D rating. And they did this as a team. So they did their mapping or identifying of the assets individually, but they discussed them as a team. Again, an opportunity to bring in all of your stakeholders, and they rated them as a team. And so an A, for example, meant that it was a valuable asset that they could leverage. B meant that it could be an asset. C meant that it would take a lot of work to make this an asset. And then D meant that it was not an asset for us as an organization, for you as a consortia, but it may be for someone else or for something else, but not for our work right now. I see, Marianne, we have a rating column for the asset, but where is the description to show why they're receiving that? And that's where what you could put in your notes. So you can use that notes section. You'll see, for example, the Urban Chamber of Commerce. The notes talk about it being an asset because you can leverage their existing relationships with businesses in the community. And so that's where you could put how you're rating it and why. Great. Okay. So this is that was part of number 6, and again, related to that, and it can. You can use it for that too, Marianne. This slide here shows how you would possibly gather the information on your assets if you are not physically out or if you are. The one that we just showed you by doing the drive-bys and the physical inventory is what you see in the turquoise, the second one down. What you learned last week a lot about was the pre-existing data from secondary resources, education, labor market, crime, stats. But the other 3 that are here, or the other 4, sorry, interviews, focus groups, community forums, and other surveys, these are all ways in which you can bring in your stakeholders into your asset gathering activities that you would want to use as opportunities to get their buy-in with what you're doing. What you can see from this is that it takes a lot of resources to really gather this data from the data that you were highlighted with the tools from last week to asset mapping to these other efforts. You want to think about the important question is thinking about, is it more important for the data collection to be done or more important to build relationships through doing the data collection? And whichever way you want to fling on that, the implications for the relationship building are critical regardless. So again, it is something to consider when you think about the advantages and disadvantages of asset mapping. I understand that resources are always a concern, but it's a necessary step to do this work right and to do it well so that we are actually gathering valuable information that can help us with addressing our community's needs. All right. So this is an example of an asset map from, this was on gathering information related to, I think it was a healthy communities work that was being done, and these are some of the assets that they specifically identified here to help them in doing that. The branches represent the different categories of the assets that they wanted to look at, and then you'll see specific assets that were identified here. This is a different visual representation, but one that you might want to use and leverage. So just quickly, I want to get your thoughts. As you've learned about community asset mapping, this is a very quick overview. What
think about how you're going to approach the community asset mapping component of the 3-year plan. So if you can just take a moment and think about what we shared and highlighted a few moments ago and share, given this, how are you approaching the community asset mapping component of the 3-year plan? I'll give you a few seconds to start sharing your thoughts. So Dana, as many brains and resources as possible, good, bringing in all of your stakeholders and giving each of the rep an assignment for their region, perfect. That's a great way of looking at dividing and conquering and gathering as much input from all of those who are stakeholders as possible. Eileen, professional development, highlighting a 3-year plan, and you're going to share some of the tools to see if we can include them in this workshop. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Gail, thank you. Gathering information for our schools areas, approaching staff members, perfect, because everyone is a stakeholder and is important to this work that we're doing. So as I said, I wanted to give you an overview of community asset mapping, but really to start making strong, direct connections to the work that you're doing with your 3-year planning. And so that's what we're going to move into now. And your 3-year planning you've been given several components that compose what I'm calling your toolkit for 2019 to 22. And that is, you were given the initial guidance that was shared with you in the fall. You were given the template that was shared shortly after that, and specifically sections 2.2 on the pre-planning and sections 2.3 on the planning really relate directly to community asset mapping. And then you also have the planning tool site, which has over 60 resources and highlights webinars that can be used to help you with your planning and asset mapping. And then your 3-year planning toolkit, and you'll see the link for that is provided here as well. And all of this leads us to June the 7th, which I know you're saying that date can't get here soon enough. You want to get your plan done and submitted and be done with this requirement that you have to complete. But I want you to think about it in terms of you only have until June the 7th to really do the work of getting to know your community, your region, your street by street view of what all the assets are that are available to help you do your work. And so specifically looking at each of these components, well, really the guidance and the templates, we're going to highlight where asset mapping falls in so that you can see those direct connections. So in your guidance in section 2.2, the pre-planning, there are some key pieces here. The first part under the directions talks about key partners and having those key partners really to help you think about what Table 1 requires, which is the entities that are going to be and that are providing education and workforce services in your region. What you'll see on these next several slides is there'll be several circles with numbers in them, and the numbers show the direct task and the connection to the step that's a component of the community asset mapping. So again, on page 5 and page 7 of the guidance, you'll see here step 4, which is where we're starting to identify the assets for the table, and the stakeholders, which is really part of 3. All that's a part of section 2.2. The bullet number or the circle number 3 also there says potential planning conversations include, and it asks you to convene with stakeholders. That is step 3 in your asset mapping. You're going to have to do it anyway, so do it the way that it should be done so that you get the best results for your community, for your consortia. And then step 2, where at the bottom of section 2.2 it says helpful questions to ask. Who provides education and workforce services to adults in your region? We already mentioned that under the critical questions. So that again speaks directly to asset mapping connections. Same thing as you look at the actual template under 2.2, you'll see the pre-planning assessment. The tool here, table 4 or table 1, the regional service providers, this is very, very similar to the mapping tool document that's listed as item number 2 that we shared earlier that you'll have as a tool to download. It asks you to identify the types of assets you want to identify, which is asset mapping step 4, to determine what your goal is, which is that gray area right under the broad part of the template where you get to, for your own writing and your own narrative, you can identify what the questions are that you're seeking to answer as a part of your pre-planning. I would certainly write that into the document. And then 6, where you're actually identifying the maps and the assets, if you look at table 1 as it's provided, it asks you to provide the description of the services provided. I think it was Marianne who asked that earlier, was wanting to know where do you provide the descriptions. And so this is where you provide it here, but it's built off of the notes section in your mapping tool, item number 2 that you can download. And then from the guidance, section 2.3, the community needs and customers, here you want to make sure that you are looking at page 7 in the guidance. This refers to part 4, step 4, where you're identifying the assets under 2.3. It also has the questions that you would ask. So again, we have identified questions earlier in the presentation that you shared, but here these are some of the critical questions that they're asking you to ask under 2.3. Again, they can be written into your narrative response for your actual template with the answers to those as a way of framing what your narrative will look like. And then this whole section on community needs and customers really requires you to do step 1, which is identifying the community that you're evaluating and looking at, and then starting to plot it actually on the map, which is step 6. And then the template component that relates to 2.3 is, or that relates to 2.3 in the guidance, is also 2.3 in the template. And again, thinking about this is where you get to provide your narrative. And what I've been told before is that you want to make sure that you use this for what works for you, that the reason that it is provided as a blank template is because we want you to have the freedom to include what you feel is most relevant. And again, this could be where you speak to the critical questions that you've chosen to address, where you include an image of the map as you've done your asset mapping. Um, you can describe obviously what you found, which is number 6 in the asset mapping. You can write that into the narrative here too, or actually, again, put the image of what you found, your actual map. I see Marianne had asked again how to use that description piece, and that's where you can also write that here. So these are direct connections that speak to how asset mapping can be used to help you complete your plan and complete the task of doing the pre-planning as well. So we've talked a lot about asset mapping, the tools and the steps in it. And what I want to give you a moment to think about now are 3 questions. The first one is to ask you to consider, how are you currently gathering data for community asset mapping? What challenges are you encountering as you try to gather the data? Are you finding it hard to get stakeholders to actually do a street by street, or is it too much time? What are the challenges? And then how are you addressing the challenges? So you'll see 3 chats below the slide. If you can take a moment and share your thoughts on how you are gathering data, the challenges with gathering data, and how you're addressing those challenges. I'll give you a moment and then we'll talk about that. Good, thank you for sharing that, CJ. And we are a much smaller and more intimate group now, so this is also your chance to really share honestly what's working for you and what challenges you're having as you're attempting to do this work. So please use this as an opportunity, again, given where we're at as a group now. All right, so I see surveys, looking at labor market data, finding out how to get information from the stakeholders through existing meetings and the workforce regional meetings and through surveys, and then some monthly meetings where the stakeholders are invited. Great, thank you for sharing that. And then in terms of the challenges that you're encountering with gathering the community asset mapping data, Gail identified that one of the challenges is just needing to get guidance from the leaders within the consortium, from probably all of the members within the consortium as well. CJ, thank you for sharing. So the challenge for you was community outreach beyond our key stakeholders is limited. Yes, and sometimes the stakeholders that we think are the ones that should be the key stakeholders, they're only telling us part of the picture, and so it's a challenge to, you don't know what you don't know. Oh yes, and time. This work does take time, but ways in which you can balance that in terms of a solution to addressing that challenge of time is thinking about how you can make asset mapping actually fun exercises to delegate and learn about your community. I think one of the responses from an earlier chat was one of the approaches you would use is to really assign different parts of the community for folks to build relationships with and to sort of be ambassadors for those different areas within the region. Um, they get to take on a new responsibility, and they own bringing in the relevant information about the assets within those areas because it's theirs. So good, good, good. I'm glad you like that idea. Um, all right, so I see Lionel typing, and we're going to be moving on to something that I think will give you an opportunity to think through a little bit more about, um, yes, so it has to be, you have to continue to maintain it. That is true. And that's a piece, as I said, you want to leverage work that you did when you did your needs assessment several years back, but understand that as the economy changes, those assets in the community also change. What existed 3 years ago might not exist now, and what exists now might look different 3 years from now. And so it is a constant need to stay in touch with and familiar with what the assets are that you are looking at in the community. I'm hoping that I'm going to move us into an activity that you will find fun and useful for your asset mapping work. I mentioned early on that we're going to be looking at a case study, and it's a consortium called Mawahil Adult Education Consortium. You can ask us later how we came up with that name. But this consortium, a little bit about it, it's a 6-member consortium, one community college district. There are 5 K-12 adult school agencies within this consortium. It's in a large suburban community with some strange pockets of rural that you wouldn't think would be there, but they are. And there are high concentrations of English language learners in the northern part of this consortium. I'm going to show you one of the ways in which I start doing asset mapping exercises, actually going to a map to see where it is, what I'm looking at, what the geographic area is. And so right now, you're going to be able to see what this map actually is. It's quite small, but maybe you can make it a little bit larger on your screen. That blue area there describes, or not describes, but shows the area of our map. And if you look north towards the mountain range there, that's that more rural area that we were describing. This is supposed to be pretend. Some of you might know where this area actually is. Um, if you do, just keep going with it and assuming it's our Mohilwa Adult Ed Consortium case study. As you see here, the population's almost 1 million. 3.7 is the average household size. The median income is $64,139. A pretty young community with the median age being 35. 1 in 4 don't have a high school diploma, and only 25% of adults do have the high school diploma. So again, when they say 1 in 4 don't, you want to think about that as that's covering the entire population, including children. 26% have some college, 22% have a bachelor's. Owner occupancy rate 60%, 59%. Then other household demographics that are here, 41% rental occupied homes, and then you'll see the total households in the middle. So my question for you, you've seen Mohilwa or Mawahil Adult Ed Consortium. You've seen some information about what it's composed of here, some demographics around it here. The question I have for you to think about as you think about community asset mapping for your own community is, what would be the best way, given what you've learned and what you know now, that Mawahil Adult Ed Consortium should use? What's the best approach that they should use to start community asset mapping, given what you've learned about them, how many members there are, their size, the demographics that you can find from that secondary data first run, which is what we talked about earlier. what would be the best thing that they should do to get started with their community asset mapping? And I'll go back to show you this slide so that you can think about it a little bit more. And there's no right or wrong answer. Just getting you to think about it because this is your reality. When we get done with this webinar today, for those of you who haven't started yet doing your community asset mapping, you'll need to do that so that you can complete your plan. So if you were Mawahil Adult Ed Consortium, what is the best approach that they should use, that you would use to start gathering information on your community, to do your community asset mapping? I'll give you a few minutes to think through that and type in your responses. And I'm going to ask if everyone on the webinar can please participate in this piece because it really helps all of us by having you think through this as a group. Help us benefit from your thoughts. All right, so I see several of you typing in things that you think they should do to get started with this process. Divide up the work either geographically or by asset type. I like the asset type approach. That might work. We could also begin to define the services that are currently provided, good CJ, and consider what we want to do in the suburb area versus the rural areas because they have different ecosystems and systems of support in place. Good. Ask some of those critical questions, determine what they are for the consortium as a whole and maybe how they differ by the regional areas. Identify all the sub-regional demographics. Good, Gail. Thank you. Begin by making the community assets in the north part of the consortia. Very good. Conduct surveys and form a committee. Good. Thank you. Good. What are the barriers keeping those who want a high school diploma from getting those? Very good, Eileen. Very good. You guys are getting this. This is excellent. So look closely at the folks here without a high school diploma and determine what assets and areas and what are the barriers are for them. Perfect. Thank you all so much. You're understanding why we have to do this work and how you can do it in ways in which it doesn't have to be overwhelming, that you can look at different components of your consortia to gather the assets. If you think you know a lot about a particular area in your region already, you don't have to spend as much time there, but spend where you need to learn. Spend the time where you need to learn. All right. Thank you for that. Thank you for engaging in the input. So the last thing that I have for you as a tool is actually a community asset mapping checklist, and you can download this. It's item number 3, CAM checklist fillable. It gives you the steps that we've talked about within community asset mapping, the 6 steps that we've identified, and then the opportunity to check if you've completed it or not. And if not, you see on the far right, you can write down the notes, concerns, when you're going to complete it. You can make this your timeline for each of those steps as well. So this is a tool, again, available for you to continue doing this work and hopefully help make sure that you don't miss any of the steps because they really build off of each other. So as I said when we started, the essence of community asset mapping really covers these 3 pieces: discover, ask, and connect. And if we're all in education, so we kind of know what a KWL is, and we use that in our classrooms with students. Well, instead of thinking about a KWL, know, what, learned, you can think of this instead as a DAC, discover, act, connect. Discover is what did you learn in the process and what do you want to learn in the process, but what did you learn? And then ask is the questions, what did you ask, what questions were asked, and then the connect, how were connections, and in this case in particular, made to the guidance and the template for your planning. So what have you discovered? What critical questions did you decide to ask? And what connections have you made with the work that you need to do for your planning and pre-planning? DAC, Discover, Act, Connect. I want to leave you with that along with some resources to help support your asset mapping efforts. These will show you some other opportunities to dig deeper into asset mapping. Then I want to also make sure that you remember that next week is part 3 of our mini series. It will be on the 29th, a week from today. It's 3-year planning. Where do we go next? And both myself, along with Sudie Whalen and Greg Hill, which for those who didn't guess, and we're trying to figure out the Mawa Hill, we kind of put our last names together to come up with the Mawa Hill Consortium for you. I hope that you're able to join us next week in the final piece of this webinar mini-series. This one will be available for you in a recorded session that has both halves blended together. So thank you again for those folks who were able to join us in the second half. And we want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have about this webinar that I can answer in the next few minutes from Dana on how exhaustive or detailed does a map have to be. And it doesn't have to be detailed. It's up to you what your critical questions are that you're looking at, because that will determine the type of assets that you want to focus on as you're doing your getting to know your region and getting to know your community, getting to know your consortia. If you're planning to include it as a visual within your plan, that's one of the reasons I shared the example earlier with the tree branches. You can use something like that to actually show your map like this, or you can actually use the mapping tool and show what you actually did, and you can add to that columns if you'd like to show new assets identified or things that you knew about already. You can be creative, and then you can actually place a physical map too if you want it to do that too. It's up to you. The thing that Neil has shared several times is they don't want you to feel restricted in how you report what you're including in your plan and how you share and describe that. So I hope that answers your question. And again, thank you all very much. It can look like this as an example. Perfect. All right. Thank you. Have a good rest of the afternoon, and thanks for coming back. I appreciate you all. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you, Sharice, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. The resources will be available on the California Adult Education website later on this afternoon. I have posted the URL of exactly where these resources will be located. Once we close the webinar room, if there are no additional questions, the evaluation will appear on the screen. I would like for everyone to please complete the evaluation and let Sharice know what you thought about today's webinar, its content, the resources that were available, and the conversations that took place during the webinar, and any additional feedback that you may have. Or